Welcome. My name is Ricardo Ernst. I'm the director of the Global Business Initiative. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to what definitely is a very timely topic, deciphering the future of U.S.-China economic relations. The event is co-sponsored by the McDonough School of Business Global Business Initiative and the Initiative for the U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues. U.S.-China economic ties have never been greater. Trade is booming, and China is America's largest goods trading partner, third largest export market, accounting for over 1 million U.S. jobs and the largest source of U.S. imports. Many U.S. firms see participation in the China market as critical to their global competitiveness. But tensions in the U.S.-China relationship have remained high in the first year of the Biden administration, with Washington labeling the overall relationship one of strategic competition. A tariff regime and counter-tariff regime remains in place as Washington seeks to press Beijing to curb what the United States asserts are state-led non-market policies and practices that harm American workers, farmers, and businesses. Some of the complaints about an unlevel playing field in China include cyber economic espionage against U.S. firms, poor enforcement of intellectual property rights, and extensive use of industrial policies to promote and protect industries favored by the Chinese government. China, for its part, has accused the United States of attempting to contain and suppress Chinese economic and technological development. President Biden and President Xi have agreed to meet in a virtual summit sometime later this year, and economic issues will no doubt be high on the agenda. But what will be the future trajectory of the economic relationship between the world's two largest economies? How intense will the strategic competition in such arenas as high technology and artificial intelligence become, and can it be bounded and new understandings be reached? I'm delighted that we have with us this evening some distinguished scholars and practitioners to help us explore the complicated dynamics at play in bilateral economic ties and hopefully to prognosticate on the future. We have asked Dr. Scott Kennedy to lead off our discussion with a short scene setter that will be followed by a panel discussion. Scott Kennedy is a senior advisor and trustee chair in Chinese business and economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. A leading authority on Chinese economy policy, Kennedy has been traveling to China for over 30 years. His specific areas of expertise include industrial policy, technology innovation, business lobbying, U.S.-China commercial relations, and global governance. Kennedy received his PhD in political science from George Washington University, his MA in China Studies from the Johns Hopkins of Advanced International Studies, and a BA's from the University of Virginia. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Scott Kennedy.
Well, this is wonderful to be here in person. I want to thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction, and it's great to be on a university campus. Again, I spent 15 years at Indiana University, and you know, there's almost nothing better than teaching except working at a think tank. But I actually really like being on campuses, and especially when I can do it in person. And as you're alluding to, and as we're all wearing masks, you know, we're all grounded in a lot of the business school programs to take students around the world to provide advice and learn. For businesses to travel, it's very difficult to do international business when you can't get on an airplane or a train. And when your job is to study companies and industries, it's super difficult. I'm lucky at CSIS to have some amazing talent to help me, Georgetown grads. So I really appreciate the great work that Georgetown University does in training folks to help us study all different parts of the world. What I was asked to do is just to provide some initial remarks about this debate that the U.S. and others are having about what kind of economic relationship we want with China. And over the last 2.5 years now, almost exactly, the U.S. has been debating the idea of decoupling. Should we separate our economies from China's in trade, investment, technology, travel, because the risks are so high? Or should we partially decouple and just focus on the risks that are highest? Or are we missing the picture, and in fact there's a lot more opportunities than risks, and we need to modestly mitigate risks and exploit those opportunities? That's the debate that we've been having to no end. But one of the really interesting things, which is just remarked, is while we've been talking about decoupling, we're still highly coupled. We still trade enormous amounts with each other, over 600 billion a year. We still, in terms of direct investment, at very large amounts, as you'll hear from others. And in terms of portfolio investment and dollar flows, actually more than ever is flowing between the U.S. and China, despite what you hear about Chinese companies being potentially delisted from the New York Stock Exchange and others not being able to list in the first place. We're talking $5 trillion of finance, which far outweighs actually the trade flows. So there's still a lot. We're still pretty tightly coupled. So this is in some ways a typical Washington, D.C. conversation about a world that we think we might want to have as opposed to the world that it is. Nevertheless, Washington does set a lot of rules. We have a lot of power, and we need to have this conversation. So I wanted to offer a few remarks about this, and then I'm going to turn things over to Evan Medeiros and the fine panel assembled to debate. Hopefully they'll throw some rocks at some of the ideas I put out, and we'll have a good discussion tonight. I want to begin just by mentioning U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai, because she gave a speech recently at CSIS, and her speech was notable because it was supposed to be the unveiling of the Biden administration's China trade policy. And I don't know if folks had a chance to watch it or read after or watch after. And it was one of the first events we actually had in person. I got the chance to sit there, and I even got to ask a question which she didn't answer. So, which is, typical in my house. I ask my kids questions. I never get an answer. I'm still trying to figure that out. But in any case, she made 2 points, 2 pieces of news. She said she was going to start to have a quote unquote conversation with the Chinese about economic issues, and she was going to renew a process for exclusions for American companies seeking to import Chinese goods that were currently covered by the $360 billion on various tariffs. But that's all she said. She didn't use the negotiation word. She didn't mention Liu He by name. She just said Chinese counterpart. She wouldn't even say the word phase 1 agreement. And she wouldn't declare whether China had been meeting the obligations of the phase 1 agreement or not meeting it. She really played poker with us. How did she do? Well, just really depends. It's a Rorschach test. Some people thought she did great. She said she doesn't want the U.S. and China to decouple. She wants them to recouple. She said that she didn't, launch huge attacks criticizing Chinese trade policy or industrial policy. The most positive assessments came from China. The next morning, we had an event with 2 leading Chinese trade experts, both of whom, without having gotten the text from the foreign ministry, because it was too soon, gave very ringing endorsements of her speech. Others were less sympathetic. Others criticized her for not having a plan and hence being very vague. And they point to debates that are still ongoing within the Biden administration about what to do on a whole range of issues, including China and trade. The final view from some folks was that instead of really holding out an olive branch to China or being totally unprepared, is that she was carefully preparing an attack on China. That she was essentially needing to be vague because she's still marshaling her resources. She's getting ready to have Congress pass hundreds of billions of dollars in spending to support American industrial policy, and she's and the rest of the administration is working to get allies on board to be tougher on China, whether it's through security arrangements like the Quad or AUKUS, or on economic issues like the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council. She finished up the meeting and immediately went to the airport and got on a plane and to Paris, went to the OECD. She's been back 3 times to Europe. Why does she get to travel and we don't? I don't know. But she keeps traveling and is working on all these things. And there's this drumbeat. My sense is that although one might assume she was holding out an olive branch, and there's plenty of evidence, if one wants to point to, that they still don't know where North is on trade and China policy. Actually, I think their predilection is to actually amp up the pressure on China quite a bit, and that they're preparing to turn more negative. It's clear that her emphasis and the administration's with regard to China is about Chinese industrial policy. At yesterday's WTO policy review that is held every 3 years for every WTO member, the U.S. statement said, the United States' most fundamental concern with China's trade regime involves China's industrial policies. Almost no mention of the Phase 1 deal or anything else. So they are beginning to build a case and evidence that could down the road in the next few months lead to a Section 301 investigation, which will then, you can anticipate finding results that, hey, the Chinese state spends money on industrial policy and it's a lot. And then would call for penalties. And they're trying to talk to allies about doing similar things and taking like-minded steps, even if not identical steps. So to me, she sounds more pessimistic about the U.S.-China relationship than U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer. In fact, they say a lot of the same things. The one example of industry that she talked about at CSIS was the steel industry. That was Bob Lighthizer's favorite industry to talk about. And she seemed even more pessimistic because she said that there's no way to change China. And in fact, Bob Lighthizer's whole reason for being at USTR was to change China by denying access to the American market and tariffs to force the Chinese to change. So she seems even less optimistic than he did. She sounds almost Navarro-like in her critique of China, which is saying a lot. So she may not want to decouple the U.S. from the Chinese market, but she gave in the speech a total of 0 reasons why the U.S. and China should have a commercial relationship. Why it's more important than just simply providing opportunities for companies to make profits. And I think that's the real missing link for American policy towards China, is that as long as we just simply frame it as nice but not critical to America's core national interests, then we will be slipping and sliding toward decoupling, either intentionally or unintentionally through tit-for-tat moves. Either Washington and Beijing or individual companies that decide the costs and risks are too high and they're going to diversify their supply chains or seek talent in other places or send students to other places to study. We will somewhere slip and slide in that direction without a positive argument. So I want to try and give you a little bit of sense of what a positive argument might be before I turn things back to the group. And it's going to sound a little bit illogical, what my argument's going to be, because we're in illogical times. And so that's totally fine by me. Hopefully it's okay with you. So the typical standard argument for justifying the relationship is the positive sum nature of it. We win, they win. It helps us, it helps them. We become more peaceful friends, more like-minded. They become more like us. And therefore we should continue it, and that builds foundations for greater peace and addressing the world's problems. And I think that's true potentially, but in an era when we've decided more broadly that China is a strategic competitor. We don't not yet using the word enemy, but a competitor where its gains are our losses and our gains their losses. We have to come up with unfortunately, competitive reason why connectivity is really valuable. And so I was trying to go through the list of reasons why that might be the case, and as part of a long project I've been doing about how to maintain America's high-tech advantages over China. And I think there's a variety of reasons that I've now settled on, which to me justify keeping the relationship because it's to our competitive advantage. Although we do need to be careful about this relationship. We need what I would call careful connectivity or principled interdependence. So the first reason, and let me just say that all of these arguments have to deal with the challenge of national security. You cannot make an argument justifying the relationship purely on economic benefit grounds. You can, but I believe Evan Medeiros would tell us that in the Situation Room, that would not be the argument that would win the day. That if you're not going to have a conversation, engage the folks on the national security side, it won't be enough. You will end up being beaten in that argument. So here, for me, a few arguments one could marshal and that I agree with. The first is businesses that do high tech sell a lot to China, and they take a lot of those profits and they plow them back into R&D. So Qualcomm sells 60% of its chips to China that go into handsets there, a lot used in China, a lot used around the world. Qualcomm has one of the largest R&D programs of any company in the world. You add that to every other high-tech company that sells a lot in China, and that funds a lot of R&D that supports those companies' innovation and staying ahead of China, and also into dual-use technologies. So that's critically important. Maintaining connectivity in terms of people and talent is absolutely central to America's ability to innovate and prosper. Those 370,000 students that were here on May 1st, 2019, many of them still here from China, absolutely critical, working in our research labs and universities and companies and other organizations, very few of them going back to China. That's a competition the U.S. is winning because of its open society. Plenty of risks from a very small set of scholars and students, but on the whole, hugely beneficial. You can manage that risk while also reaping the huge rewards from the upside of the talent competition. The benefits, economic benefits to our relationship raise the cost to the Chinese to engage in open conflict. Taiwan is the walking example of a island or a country, call it what you want, that they don't want to decimate because it's so critical to their economy. Obviously, it's 40% of Taiwan's exports, but it's a huge percentage of all of the tech that goes into products that the Chinese consume or export. So that is what Tom Friedman used to call the McDonough's theory of peace, and we might now call it the TSMC theory of peace. The connectivity reduces the costs of communication, which helps you spot conflicts in advance and address non-standard security risks. So finally, though, but I think to me the most important argument that sounds zero-sum is that maintaining economic connectivity and high tech with China is what is central to the U.S. maintaining its dominance over China and China's dependence on us. In sector after sector, the U.S., its friends in Europe, and Japan are at the top. And the Chinese have been catching up, but almost in no industry fully catching up. In fact, there's a glass ceiling, and sometimes a cement ceiling in industry after industry, where we have, through connectivity, joint ventures, tech transfer agreements, licensing, being consumers, providing talent, the Chinese advanced a lot. But in just about every single one of these industries, they don't advance all the way to the top. We are still in the tops in almost all these industries, no matter how you measure, whether it's by patents, royalties, or the way companies market and design their products. But to me, at the end of the day, it comes back to the core technologies. So most of these technologies in these sectors actually have clear hierarchies. There's core technologies which are really critical. And the US and its friends control almost every single one of those. So even in places like in telecom, where the Chinese have improved a lot, they are improving inside our systems. So some people talk about the US and China as two racers on a track running, and you can either try and trip the Chinese up or run fast. Actually, we designed the stadium. We designed the track. We hired the referees. They're competing on our turf and our systems. And that's in the sectors where they're doing really well. In the sectors where they're not doing as well, they are getting further and further behind. In aerospace, they are further behind every single year. They're trying to make a plane. They're way behind. They're not catching up. When they finally get the C919 in the air, when you look at the plane, you'll realize that's an American plane. Because everything in that plane that keeps it in the air is from the United States or from Europe. The only thing that's on that plane that's Chinese are some of the escape hatches. Totally honest. Even the paint is not from China because it's too difficult to paint a plane really well given Chinese air quality. So my view, which is the foundation of my argument, is that we're still ahead and we have huge advantages, and the relationship helps us maintain those, and we ought to continue to use them. Obviously, areas of significant risk where we need export controls, investment restrictions, other things, but broadly speaking, we benefit from the relationship, and if we can manage the risks, we can exploit and extend our advantages. Now, let me conclude by saying that sounds great perhaps to an audience like this in the United States in Washington, D.C. If I got on a plane, which someday maybe I'll get to do, and go over to Beijing and speak in front of the National Development Reform Commission or Tsinghua University or some other, and I gave that speech and I said, we want to maintain relations with you because it can extend our dominance over you. I'm probably not going to get a lot of applause, right? I think probably people will be like, we told you that's what they're trying to do. Hence, we need to develop independent technology, right? That would be the, it's like, oh, gig is up. Well, yes, the gig is up, but, you know, even if they try, we're still ahead. And in my judgment, the crux of the debate is what is more likely from a U.S. national interest perspective to extend America's lead over China and extend its dependence on us? Would it be to proactively decouple right now because they're trying so hard to become independent anyway? Or would it be to try to extend that period as long as you can? My own view is that this is not a 0 or 1 option. This is about we're playing for time. And each extra year the U.S. has as its advantage ends up translating into more years down the road. So for me, it's still the better argument compared to decoupling. And I think actually what I would like the Chinese to do is come up with their own positive argument that says they're better at exploiting our vulnerabilities and our dependence on them than we are. And they can point to lots of things that they can do, their market, their control of rare earths, their ability to engage in coercive diplomacy, and all those things. And so I think actually at the end of the day, what's most likely to keep us together economically is that we think we can outcompete them and maintain our dominance over them, and they think they can outcompete us. So the logic of extending this relationship commercially for many decades is going to be a competitive logic as opposed to one that emphasizes win-win. That it would be an ironic outcome if there ever was one. But that's why we all work in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if we're supposed to be optimistic or pessimistic after what you have said. So hopefully the panel will allow us to make that distinction. However, one thing that came very clear, at least to me, is the level of interdependence and interconnection that exists between the two countries. And it's definitely more than an economic decision, it's a political decision. And then they both work hand in hand. So thank you very much, because it was really, really interesting to hear what you have to say. Now, I would like to introduce our panel. We have first Craig Allen, is president of the U.S. China Business Council, USCBC, a private nonpartisan nonprofit organization representing over 200 American companies doing business with China. Prior to joining the USCBC, Craig had a long, distinguished career in U.S. public service, including 2 tours of duty at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing and a tour of duty in Taipei. Craig was ambassador to Brunei during the Obama administration and is a Georgetown MSFS graduate. So, Craig, just join us. We have also Dr. Evan Medeiros, is the Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies in the School of Foreign Service and the Kling Family Distinguished Fellow in the U.S. China Studies. He previously served on the staff of the National Security Council as Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and then as Special Assistant to President and Senior Director for Asia. In the latter role, Dr. Medeiros served as President Obama's top advisor on the Asia Pacific and was involved in all aspects of U.S.-China relations for 6 years, including several U.S.-China summits. Dr. Medeiros, join us, please. We have Helen, Director of Strategic at Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, CSET. She previously worked as a senior research analyst at Open Philanthropy, where she advised policymakers and grant makers on AI policy and strategy. Between working at Open Philanthropy and joining CSET, Helen lived in Beijing, studying the Chinese AI ecosystem as a research affiliate of Oxford University's Center for Governance of AI. Helen? And then we also have Dr. Vicki Tang, an associate professor in the McDonough School of Business. Professor Tang received her bachelor's degree from Peking University and her PhD degree from the University of Michigan. She joined Georgetown in 2005. Professor Tang's research expertise includes predicting future earnings using current financial and non-financial information, earnings quality and fair value accounting. Professor Tang's current research is interested in, first, how non-economic factors such as winning and dining social trust plays an important role in business decision. Second, how innovations in technology via social media has changed business forecasting, investments, the competitive landscape in lending markets and corporate finance, and finally, regulatory framework in traditional securities and the fintech space. And fourth, the China capital markets. Let me now turn it over to Evan. There's going to be moderating this. Vicki, join the panel. We have a distinguished panel, so welcome you all.
Thank you.
The floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you, Ricardo. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate you coming out on Thursday night to talk about the U.S.-China economic relationship. It's sort of one of those very detailed topics that those of us in the School of Foreign Service get very, very excited about. So we're very glad you're here. We have a superstar panel. I've worked with and collaborated with almost everybody on this panel, so I'm very excited to have all of you here. As they know, or as they've been warned, I'm a very, very active moderator. It's one of the things you learn when you serve on the National Security Council of the United States. You basically give people 30 seconds to make their argument. If it's not persuasive, you move on. So I'll be a little bit more generous than that tonight, but the focus is going to be on sort of a high tempo, high quality, very engaging discussion about the U.S.-China economic relationship. And, you know, Ricardo did a superb job at the beginning setting the stage. Right? This is a highly, highly economically interdependent relationship, right? China is our top goods trading partner, one of the, I think, the largest source of our imports, obviously one of our top overall trading partners, goods and services. But we pick up the newspaper every day, the FT, the Wall Street Journal. What do we read about? China's growing its nuclear arsenal. China tested some crazy space weapon that could descend on any part of the Earth at a moment's notice, right? So we're at an interesting inflection point in the relationship where economic interdependence is high and growing, and security competition is high and growing at the same time, right? couldn't be any more different than the historic Cold War that the U.S. and the Soviet Union experienced. So in terms of international relations, we really are in terra incognita, and these people are going to explain to us how we sort this all out. So I'm going to start with Scott. And Scott, thank you for that wonderful presentation. Fantastic. Gave us a lot to think about. But I'd like you to step back for a second, because your presentation was spectacular on sort of where we are today, and in particular, the direction of U.S. policy toward China on economic questions. But for this crowd, will you just set the stage? What are the top 3 challenges in the U.S.-China economic relationship, either from the American side or the Chinese side, right? What are the big challenges confronting this highly interdependent relationship?
Well, thanks, Evan. Well, I've only got 28 seconds left to go. And whatever I say good will be based on my research assistant who used to work for Evan. So, but in terms of what's really important and critical, one has to obviously be that we have very different economic systems. That China has a state capitalist system, largely defined. Ours is primarily market-based. And if China were the size, had the economy the size of Ethiopia, it'd be okay. But it's not. It's much bigger, and therefore the economic consequences and distortions from China's system are global and affect American producers and our ability to innovate. And so that's probably challenge number 1. The other is that in terms of providing global public goods, these 2 different kinds of systems set us up for a competition, encouraging us to compete, and make it much more unlikely for us to find common ground when we need to in areas like public health and climate. The last is that we've got to innovate, and innovation is super critical. And in order to innovate, you've got to have the best human capital and the best universities and systems to support it. And because we are focused on the competition with China and the strategic challenge and a lot of other ones, I think we have forgotten or lost the theme about really how to make our system work well. So to me, those are 3 big challenges that we face.
And that's great. Let me ask you about number 1. So state capitalism versus democratic capitalism. And so you said the challenge is our systems are different. So are you saying that the U.S. policy should be oriented on changing their system to make it more like ours? And if so, how exactly are we going to do that?
Yeah. I think what we should do is set it up based on the possibility that they might adapt, because adaptation is to eventually their benefit, because the costs of state capitalism eventually accrue significantly over time. Once you get beyond the catch-up phase where you can see the target and industrial policy makes sense, but when you're trying to innovate into new space, then the costs grow. But they haven't realized that yet. And so I think we ought to create systems and opportunities that encourage them to adapt and change according to commitments that they themselves made and promised. Well, they signed a 5,000-page document to accede to the WTO. They didn't have no one twisted their arm. They agreed to every word on the page, all those pages. So it's not our expectations that are not being met; it's theirs that they're not fulfilling. So I think we should try to continue that. But if we can't, because they're a sovereign country, then we have to focus on building the world that we want. And if they join that world, then great, they can contribute to it. If they can't, we still should have the world that we want, which is market democracy supported by institutions that strengthen them.
So one more question for you, Scott, and then I'm gonna go to Craig. So 2/3 of the world trades more with China than they do with the United States, right? China looks at us and they think, look at what happened in the global financial crisis. Look at the rise of populism in the West, right? Which was borne out because of social inequality and other macroeconomic imbalances. So they say, you Americans want us to change, but yet you're the ones that seem to be having most of the problems, and the rest of the world is trading a lot more with us than they are with you. So how exactly are we going to get them to sort of adapt to us when they feel as if they're actually doing pretty well, and that's validated by their economic relationship with the rest of the world.
I think that's a great challenge, and particularly since the U.S. Backed out of TPP, and we had a coalition of countries that had a large percentage of the world's economy in them, creating another WTO-like opportunity where we said, if you adapt and play by these rules, then you can expand economic collaboration. For some reason, we decided to steal defeat from the jaws of victory there and walk away from that. I think it may be very difficult. I think that would have worked. Now it's very difficult to try and recreate that. The Biden administration seems to be afraid of its own political shadow on anything trade and economic related. But, you know, I think the Chinese also are aware of their own challenges and problems. Massive debt, a demographic cliff that they're coming to, environmental degradation, corruption, a brittle political system that increasingly a lot of folks at home in China can't outwardly say they don't like, but we know how they feel. And their friends now are North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Hungary. That's not the world that most Chinese expected they were going to get when they became super successful. So obviously we have our own problems, and we're not going to say, hey, what you ought to do is just be like us. That would be a big mistake, whether you just tell your kids like that or you tell other countries. But we can say there are probably some rules of the road that we can all agree to where things would end up being better for both. We have to make some reforms to fix this system. You have to fix some. Hey, why don't we work on these together? We don't have all the answers. So it's not necessarily adapting to our system or letting them stay the same, but let's figure out what's new that we want to create that doesn't generate those type of ideological conflicts that you're talking about.
Thank you, Scott. Very helpful. So, Craig, you're president of the U.S. China Business Council, so you represent some of the biggest, wealthiest, most successful American companies, many of whom are deeply invested in China, have been there for decades, Boeing, Coca-Cola, etc. But you're also a career diplomat. We worked together when, in many instances, but including when you were U.S. ambassador to Brunei. So, Craig, as a sort of voice of the American business community, do you share Scott's assessment of the challenges facing the U.S.-China relationship? And how does the business community think about China? Do they see the economic challenges, the lack of a level playing field, the national security threats? Helen will tell us more about those in a little bit. Is that how they see China, or do they see China as an opportunity?
Terrific question. Firstly, thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be here this evening. When you asked Scott, what are the three big challenges, I was in my own head, I would term it as technology. That's the biggest challenge. The second biggest challenge is supply chains and avoiding a single point of failure and having resilience within our supply chains. And I think that the third biggest challenge is a Chinese system which systematically creates overcapacity in targeted areas. We've seen that in steel and aluminum, in solar panels, and many other industries. And whatever is targeted, you end up with enormous overcapacity, which has a global impact. Now, are the American companies looking at China? I'd say you have to really disaggregate and look at it industry by industry. American farmers are having the best year ever this year, and American prices in the grain belt are very good, thank you. Consumer goods companies are doing extremely well with the 700 million in the Chinese aspiring middle class who have tastes very similar to ours. In the energy area, we are having the best year ever, and next year will be better yet, especially with prices going up. These are good times. I would say in industrials, it's complicated, but certainly the chemicals industry, very strong. Automotive, very strong. It is when you get to high tech, that you have difficulties. And we could disaggregate life sciences, aerospace, semiconductors, electronics, different problems there. But that is where the debate on decoupling is taking place.
And so I want to touch on that because there's been a lot of discussion in the business community in Washington and the markets community about decoupling, this idea of, American companies moving out of China. From your perspective, practical business perspective, how much decoupling really happened as a result of Trump's policies, the tariffs, etc.?
Well, I hesitate to say zero, but it's something close to that.
Really?
There is, in the financial world, there is no sign of decoupling. In agriculture, we're selling more now than we've ever sold before. In energy as well. In the semiconductor space, as a result of export controls and various sanctions put on Chinese military companies, there has been a decline in American sales and a commensurate increase, by the way, in European and Japanese sales, companies that are not bound by our export control regime. So I think if you were a one-armed Martian economist who were visiting the Earth and looking at this trade relationship, you'd say it's very much as Adam Smith and David Ricardo would have suggested, that both countries are trading in accordance to comparative advantage, that they're reaching their comparative advantage, both sides are applying their comparative advantage, and that the future looks pretty good. And I think generally that is true outside of specific technological areas where both governments are concerned about dependence on the other
So
side.
one more question on this, and then I want to go to Helen and talk about national security and technology. So in the sort of world of politics and foreign policy, we hear a lot about notional complaints from the business community. The Chinese cheat, the Chinese steal, and that most importantly, there's an unlevel playing field, right? And so you go to China, there's one set of rules for Chinese private companies and SOEs, there's another one for Western companies, and you better be careful that you don't lose your shirt. And you listen to a speech from USTR Catherine Tai, and she sort of promotes these views that doing business in China is low profit, high risk. You seem to be telling a different story. How do I reconcile these two?
So I do agree that the playing field is not level, and that Chinese state-owned companies will kick the ball down a pretty steep hill. Chinese privately owned companies are playing uphill a little bit, and foreign companies are playing up a much steeper hill. That is absolutely true. But even with that reality, foreign companies are still doing very well in the China market, and you could take any particular part of the China market and talk about how the Europeans are doing, the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Americans, and most companies are doing very well. China represents, over the last 10 years, 30% of global growth, and we have taken a relatively large share of that. I suspect that for the next 10 years, China will take about 30% of global growth. East Asia, 40% of global growth. Throw in India, 50% of global growth. American companies are going to remain in China. We are going to be leaders in China if we are to remain global leaders. And if we leave China, given the scale and the speed at which the Chinese move, we are not going to be global leaders. And therefore, we are committed to this market, and we will expand our investments there, and we will continue to be successful and fight for that level playing field, which the WTO promised us, and which TPP may be out there somewhere in the future.
Thank you, Craig. That's a very comprehensive economic perspective. Now I want to bring in the national security perspective, right? Because economic interdependence, security competition. And Helen, so the questions of national security most often come in on questions of technology. the Chinese steal our technology. The Chinese outcompete us on certain technologies. So talk to us a little bit about technology in the context of the U.S.-China economic relationship. What are the risks? What are the opportunities? And do American technology companies, do they feel like, do they see China as a risk or an opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to build off something you said and also something that Scott was talking about in his initial remarks, his opening remarks. You said we're in terra incognita, and I think that's completely right. I forget if I stole this phrase from you as well, but we're in strategic competition under conditions of globalization for the first time. We don't know how to do that. There's no playbook. And the way that finds expression in technology is that you have, at a first cut, what seems like this tension between the national security and the economic interest. On the national security side, the U.S. wants to win. We want to be competitive in these technologies. We want to protect our sensitive technologies that we developed. Versus on the economic side, you want the interconnection and the markets and so on and so forth. And that's all true. That's all correct. But then also, if you look deeper, you also find that the national security and the economic interests are much more intertwined than we often think they are, and that there's this very difficult set of trade-offs between some of the dynamics that Scott was pointing to. So on the one hand, we know that there have been plenty of instances of Chinese folks coming to the United States and stealing IP. They do it in various ways. Sometimes it's very blatant. It's, they hack into a company's systems and they literally just steal the IP. Other times it's something, we talk about research security in the national security context. Something subtler like, a Chinese student comes to the United States, works in a lab, learns a lot of stuff in that lab that's very useful, goes back to China, uses that for some kind of national security related purpose. Has something gone wrong there? National security folks would say yes. But at the same time, if we try too hard to tackle these threats, and the techniques that we use are to shut people out entirely, or to try and silo ourselves off completely, then we risk damaging or even destroying the open, interconnected global ecosystem, which has really benefited the United States enormously over the past decades. And we see the same thing with export controls, supply chains. It's very difficult. There are certain places where we can place very targeted export controls, but in many cases, it's very difficult to create these protected U.S. spaces without really damaging sort of that fabric, that interconnected global fabric.
So let's take one sector because it's always easier to focus on examples.
Yep.
Semiconductors,
yep.
right? Probably the most high-profile issue at the heart of economic competition
yep.
and national security concerns, right? Should American companies be cooperating with China on semiconductors? The Chinese want to be a semiconductor superpower. America and its friends and allies are already a semiconductor superpower. What do we do?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, and I appreciate that you've asked it to me because the center that I work at,
yes.
at Georgetown, has done a lot of work on the semiconductor supply chain. And here, it's really important to be distinguishing between exactly what we're talking about. So something that's really interesting in the semiconductor supply chain is to distinguish between, so semiconductors are an interesting product, right? Because they are both an end product. There's this whole big supply chain that ends up with a chip, but then they're also an intermediate good because they get built into all kinds of different further products. And so I really want to distinguish between selling finished chips versus selling the equipment that you need to make the chips. And so something that we at CSET have really promoted from a national security perspective is the idea that there are certain pieces of semiconductor manufacturing equipment, so what you need to put in the factories to make the chips, certain pieces of this equipment that are incredibly sophisticated, incredibly high-tech. The sort of clearest example is a
ultraviolet lithography,
that's
right?
That's the one.
Right. You don't think that this term is important, but trust me, this is one that's going to become a household term, right?
My favorite stat about this piece of equipment is that the highest end machines, these are used to make the very best, most advanced semiconductors. They contain these mirrors. The mirrors are so smooth that if you expanded a piece of the mirror to be the size of Germany, the biggest bump on this Germany-sized mirror would be 1 millimeter high. That's how smooth. So this is an incredibly, exquisitely high technology piece of equipment, and it's really only manufactured by this one Dutch company. And so it turns
So
out that
one Dutch company
is-
makes these.
is overwhelmingly
No Japanese companies, no Korean ones.
That's correct. At the very highest level of semiconductors, so we're talking the most advanced node, 5
So,
nanometer,
like-
3 nanometer chips.
Right, got it.
So there's one company. So that's a place where you can actually say, look.
So should the United States work with our partners in Europe and deny the Chinese the capability to have this semiconductor manufacturing equipment?
I would say yes. I would say this is a place where we can use that as a point of leverage in the supply chain to maintain the current state of affairs in semiconductors is not that the U.S. can manufacture all the best semiconductors. That's totally not true.
Right.
It's an incredibly globally interconnected supply chain, and I think that's very beneficial. And so what we want to do is we want to prevent China from being able to have its own full stack, go-to-woe semiconductor manufacturing capacity. So what you do is you look for these bottlenecks in the supply chain, like
Right.
the extreme ultraviolet photolithography machines. If China doesn't
Say
have
that 3 times fast.
no, thank you. And we can hold on to those, and this is why I
Right.
said at the beginning we have to get really specific about what we're talking about. Hold on to those. That means that the supply chains continue to be global, interconnected. But then we sell chips into China, no problem. Obviously, we don't sell to military end users. There's certain exclusions for end users that are known to be violating human rights. But on the whole, you can maintain this very strong.
Okay, so that's semiconductors. Can you do it in AI? Can you do it in life sciences? Right? Can you do it in additive manufacturing, 3D printing?
Gosh, I mean, I thought you were just going to ask me the one easy question where I had the great answers and then I'd get to stop. But no, I think it's actually much harder in these other sectors. I think that dynamic where you can prevent them from building up a domestic industry and then continue to sell the semiconductor chips product is a very nice situation for the United States. I think in most other industries, and I'd be very curious to hear what other panelists think about this, I think in most other industries, coming back to the terra incognita, we don't know how to make these trade-offs between what is it okay for us to give them access to, where does it benefit us in the end because the technologies get developed further and US companies continue to be world leaders, versus which things should we be holding back? When it comes to genetic data, how concerned should we be about the prospect that Beijing Genomics Institute is gathering all kinds of genetic data on us? I honestly don't know the answer to that. I have colleagues that think we should be incredibly concerned from a national security perspective. I have colleagues that think, look, open science, the global, this has been so successful for decades having these really internationalized systems. Let's keep it going. So I think for many, many industries, it's very difficult, and we can pull out one other sort of example of in my mind, easier case is something like, look, if we can identify companies that are using facial recognition in Xinjiang to help put the Uyghur population in, forced labor and internment.
I think they're already on the entities list.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That in my mind is a done deal. Let's not work with those companies. But I think in many, many cases, the trade-offs and the balances to find are much more difficult.
So Vicki, I want to bring you into the conversation. As a professor here at the McDonough School of Business, you work a lot with private Chinese companies in a variety of different sectors. What's their perspective on the U.S.-China economic relationship? Do they see the U.S. as important to their future? Are they principally interested in domestic demand and the domestic market in China? Are they aware of this growing American concern about technology sharing with China? So at the enterprise level in China, how aware are they of this big international debate?
Yeah, thanks for asking a question. Actually, I want to kind of just piggyback on Helen's point about the semiconductor. I mean, I think in terms of going back to Scott's point about the strategic competition, I think China probably has realized, this is a kind of area where the dominance probably can continue for a while. So I think China has invested over 1.5 trillion USD just in trying to improve the basic kind of research and development on semiconductor, but it's still unknown, what the outcome is. Because my general sense on the technology side of China is, if you just count the numbers, maybe in some of the measures, China is doing better in the US, but if you kind of measure the quality, I think it's much, much lower. My assessment is probably take another 30 to 50 years to catch up on the technology side. And also, going back to Evan's question about, can we hold the dominance in AI, etc. I think kind of depends on what you're talking about. I think if it's the basic kind of technology, I still think China is behind. But if it's about the innovation in the application, then in some area, I think China is probably a little bit ahead.
And what areas are you thinking of? What sectors?
So I think, especially if you think about the consumer goods, right? Think about Amazon versus Ali, right? Alibaba. So both of them started as a retailer, but I think Alibaba has grown into more, we call those called destination application, where you can do shopping, you can do finance, you can do game, you can do education, whatever, you can do all that there. But I don't think there's, a counterpart of a kind of app in U.S. has emerged as that. So I think it's, for some based on the experience I've worked on with Chinese company for at least 4 years now, and I'm just amazed at, in terms of application level, how innovative they are. Especially the innovation in the business model, how to monetize, what they have.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So Scott, one of the issues that comes up a lot is what exactly is China's economic strategy toward the United States? And we know a little bit about this because China released its 14th five-year plan earlier this year. And for the first time ever, interestingly, it had an entire chapter just on national security. So walk us through how China's view of the U.S. economy and the U.S. role in the world, and how you think they're trying to position themselves amid the debate we've heard today.
Yeah. I think their debate actually sounds a lot like the kind of debate we're having here. But they've been having this debate a little bit longer than us. I think their anxieties about globalization, they've held them longer, and then they've had examples, whether it's a global financial crisis or Snowden revelations or other things. I think there's been sort of three big steps in the debate in China about industrial policy and how they should have a relationship with the United States. I do think for a long time, beginning in the mid-1990s, when they started to actually craft specific industrial policies, 1994 is the first time they had industrial policy for a specific sector. It was one on semiconductors and one on automobiles. I think their idea was, you know what, how can we just grow this sector as much as possible, as fast as possible? We're not going to become big players in the global economy, but geez, we know that we're going to need these things. And so they followed the plans on semiconductors and autos with investments in other big, what they called mega projects, the Three Gorges Dam, other dams and things like that. And there was just like, how do we just get our foot in the door in these sectors and not just entirely import? The second stage, which we saw really at the end of the Hu Jintao era and the early part of Xi Jinping, culminating in which everyone knows, Made in China 2025, the best advertising plan the Chinese wish they'd never carried out, right? That plan said, you know what, we want to have increased market share in these sectors in China and globally. We're going to be part of these global industries, and we want to change our position in the supply chains and levels of value added and things like that. That was 2015, right? Where they are with the 14th five-year plan that you just mentioned is they're like, you know what? We don't know if being a part of global supply chains is a good thing at all. It's very risky. In fact, we won't need that entire stack that Helen mentioned. We need to have that entire capability.
So self-reliance.
Yes, yes. So they've moved quite far. So now they're sounding like 1960s language.
Import substitution, reduce reliance on the outside world, increase reliance on domestic
eliminate reliance. And so change the dependency relationship fundamentally. That's aspiration. That's Beijing talking like Washington. That is very far from reality, right? We're still ahead. They are still highly dependent. In fact, they are way more dependent on the global economy than we are. And that is not going to change as much as Xi Jinping wants it to.
And why isn't it going to change?
Well, they still need there's still many things that they can't do. And if they want an economy that grows a lot more slowly, that is a lot less efficient, that's not able to solve problems and provide goods to consumers, then they can stop buying Craig's members' stuff. And they can stop having Exxon do joint ventures or BASF and others. So if they want to drive their economy into the ditch, then they can have North Korea's economy if they'd like.
And Craig, are you and the members of the Business Council, are you concerned with this new Xi Jinping vision for the future of the Chinese economy that's about reducing reliance on others, increasing others' reliance on China, and creation of more, investing in more national champions?
So I would agree that self-reliance is a word that we hear mostly with regard to technology, but not only. There's also talk about agricultural self-reliance and energy self-reliance. And so therein is a contradiction within the Chinese economic planning apparatus. They welcome foreign companies, but insist on that the ultimate goal is self-reliance. How to square that contradiction is something that we worry about a lot, especially if that drive for self-reliance and the 1.5 trillion that Lily spoke of leads to global overcapacity in industries like semiconductors or aircraft or machine tools or others. So I think that there are absolutely huge risks here, but we believe that, well, we've been managing these contradictions for the last 40 years, and we believe that we'll be able to continue to
But
manage.
now China is the second largest economy in the world, growing at somewhere between 4 to 5%, and you have a powerful leader who might get a third term, or stay indefinitely in the future, and seems to have some different ideas about the future of the Chinese economy.
So that is absolutely true. And you have a middle class that's growing very rapidly, whose consumption is growing very rapidly too. A middle class that likes imported stuff and coming to foreign universities. And so, yes, there are a lot of tensions here on the Chinese side and on the American side between the national security arguments and the economic arguments. I agree with Scott completely that we are dirty mirrors of each other. And both countries have a real risk at posing a national security problem as a reason to engage in protectionism. I think in both countries we face that risk, and both countries would be very smart to actually implement their WTO obligations there and reduce the national security arguments to the minimum necessary. Yeah, telecom, yeah, semiconductor, but biotech, no. Let's cure cancer. Energy, no. Let's deal with climate change. Those are the types of tensions that we are dealing with.
And Vicki,
they're not going to go away.
Vicki, are we reading Xi Jinping and Chinese planning correctly? Is self-reliance in the businesses that you deal with, are they sort of much more focused on self-reliance, much less interested in global markets, much more interested in domestic demand? How is this sort of playing out at the ground level of the Chinese firm?
Just going back to another panelist comment, I think if you look at the Chinese economy, you have to kind of three pockets, right? So there's those state-owned, and then there's those private-owned, and then another bigger player is actually multinationals like a Coca-Cola. They're very big, like GM, and most of the company I work with are either privately owned or the multinationals, and just because of the nature of it, especially think about multinationals, so it's part of it. It's in their gene. It's both. So although I kind of know this, like this direction towards self-reliance on domestic demand. But honestly, from the companies that I'm working with, I haven't seen that pan out yet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Helen, to get back to some of these national security questions, a big issue sort of looming in front of the entire economic relationship is export controls, right? What is the Biden administration going to do? Are they going to expand the entity list, right? Put more Chinese companies on the entities list? Sort of give us your best guess on what the direction of export controls is and what impact you think it's going to have on the U.S.-China economic relationship.
Yeah, I mean, definitely as the preface to this, I want to come back to this idea of this is the first time that we're trying to do strategic competition under conditions of globalization. So I think anyone who thinks that the Biden administration has some great theory of how this is going to work and how it's all going to be amazing, that's not my impression of the situation. That said, my expectation. And I'd actually be very curious what you would make of this, Evan. But my expectation is that we will.
But I'm the moderator, so
put himself
so
on
I'm
the
get to
spot.
dodge all the hard questions tonight.
My expectation is that we will see an expansion. We will see an attempt to more comprehensively list some of the organizations that are connected to the Chinese state and the Chinese military. Of course, the challenge is in China delineating who is sort of significantly connected or meaningfully connected or deeply connected and who is not is nigh impossible. And so I think it is going to be a real tightrope walk for the administration to determine what counts as unacceptable and what level of shutting down these relationships or prohibiting these kinds of exchange ends up actually damaging the United States because it makes us a less attractive.
So if you had the keys to the kingdom and you got to write the export control plan, what are the top 3 sectors on your list?
Well, first I'd go home and cry a little.
Yes.
Sounds like a very terrible job to have.
So we know semiconductors is number 1, right? You get the flat glass. What else is on the list? Where do we have to maintain dominance?
I think semiconductors is the clearest one for me. I think trying to come to a clear on telecommunications, trying to come to a clearer and more principled stand on that. I think my impression of how
and
that
do you
went,
mean 5G when you say telco?
Well, I was about to say my impression of how that went down is that the national security parts of government were mostly not paying a ton of attention to 5G until suddenly it slapped them in the face. And so in terms of the technology nowadays, I think it makes sense to be looking more to 6G, looking to sort of longer term competitiveness. And I think the current measures that are in place are mostly a bit of a reactive move to the 5G situation.
And AI, that's the other big one in the room.
AI, I don't see. I mean, I think the current human rights controls make a lot of sense there. Looking for really clear cases where the technology is being used unacceptably according to U.S. values. I think that's going to continue to be the minority of cases. I personally think that AI is a sector where the research ecosystem is even more internationalized and open. You have even lots of private companies publishing their research openly, working on open source tools. That's an area where I think the prospect of export controls is a little more dicey.
So Craig, let's say the Biden team decides to implement Helen's plan of brand new export controls. What does that do to your companies that are fighting for market access, revenue, and profits on a daily basis?
So I think that the answer is that it depends on whether it's done on a multilateral basis or not. If it is done on a unilateral basis, then when the United States designates a Chinese company as being unacceptable, the Europeans and the Japanese are rushing in as we are walking away.
And the rest of Asia as well.
It's a very common phenomenon. So there are efforts to coordinate with the EU. I'm skeptical that those will work out well. I think that the arguments that Scott put forward about the sale of technology and under licensed conditions so that its use is prescribed to civilian purposes allows American companies to benefit from economies of scale, which is necessary to continue research. So I would advise the Biden administration to be very careful about expanding export controls, it's going to cost American jobs. It's going to cost American productivity. It's going to cost the ability of American companies to compete in those areas against European, Japanese, and Chinese competitors as well. So it's a very difficult balancing act that we should have, as Bob Gates said, tall walls around a narrow garden. Keep it to semiconductors. Keep it to telecom.
Fine metaphor. Good luck implementing it. Helen, what do you think?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in with an example of how this has gone wrong in the past, which is the space industry.
Yep.
And this is really, an example of what happens if you look at a technology, you say, wow, this technology sure
And
looks...
specifically, you're talking about space launch vehicles, correct?
That's right, that's correct. You look at the technology, you think, man, this looks really strategically important. We better keep it for ourselves, we better protect it, we better not let potential competitors or adversaries get their hands on it. And what happened in the 1990s was that all kinds of controls were enacted on the US space industry, and the industry just essentially lost its ability to be globally competitive because it was such a pain for any international company or entity to deal with. And so that is...
But interestingly, America is back in the SLV business, right?
We're now back in a new way, it's true. We did manage to dive back in after a period of struggle. But I do think that that was a case of how it can go wrong.
Right. So I'm mindful of the time, and I know we're getting close, but I've got one other big doozy for Scott.
Good.
Yeah. So Scott, one of the big ideas that's being debated and would be radical in the U.S.-China economic relationship is putting controls on outbound FDI, right? We all know about inbound FDI controls, the CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Now there's some discussion, do we want to, put somebody in Craig's office and make sure that all of the members of the U.S.-China Business Council, their investment before they invest in China, that their outbound FDI gets vetted? What do you think, Scott?
For the most part, no. There are, because when you're talking about investment, you're talking about money, right? Dollars. You're not talking about the technology. And it's a technology that we ought to, Occam's razor, solve the problem. So if it's technology that you're worried about, then you control the technology, the end use and the end user. There are some areas of investment you need to be concerned about because for two reasons. One is American companies or others may go to invest in China, and as part of their paid-in capital, that may actually just contribute the technology itself. And so you need to be aware of that. And so in some certain kinds of circumstances, you want to know what that is. And the other is very new technologies, which are not very valuable because they're not well known, they're not widely used. And so we need folks to have a much better understanding of what's going on in Silicon Valley. So I think most of those things, though, can be handled just simply by having much greater consultation between business and government.
So what does that mean? More consultation between business
that
and
means
government? It sounds like a think tank thing to say, Scott,
No.
but
No, it's not.
what does it mean in practice, right? This is a business school. We're practical people.
Yeah. It means that we ought to actually get out into Silicon Valley, into Austin, Boston, Bangalore. We ought to
really want to get on a plane, don't you?
Exactly. You're telling, and see what's going on and really know. And so as we watch deals, we can raise concerns about them. We'll see them coming as opposed to catching up. I mean, just to come back to the things that really bother me that I think we got to worry about besides chips. So no one's mentioned engines. To me, engines is the other giant technology where we have huge advantages, and it doesn't matter whether it's in the air, on land, or in the sea. We have huge advantages. The Chinese are struggling, so we need to protect engines. I'd say materials are another one where they're critical. And then advanced computing. There's some things that we can do at advanced computing that they definitely can't do that we ought not to share. But I think those are, again, those high walls, small garden types of ways we can protect ourselves. And I think protecting those directly as opposed to simply creating a whole new bureaucracy of folks to track every individual deal is smarter.
Well, I'm very mindful of the time. This has been a superb panel. Please join me in thanking them for an excellent discussion tonight.